Well, sadly, we've been through these shootings, mass shootings, so many times in other parts of the state or the country, but now it's happening in our own backyard. And we will remind ourselves here of the various agencies involved, what the FBI's role is, what the ATF role is, the sheriff and the local police department. Let's bring in NBC Bay Area Stephen Stock, one of our lead senior investigative reporters, with some information and background. Stephen, what do you have for us?
Well, Raj, we've been talking to several different law enforcement sources over the last several hours, and all of them tell our investigative unit that this remains a very fluid situation and is changing moment by moment. We'll get to that possible second suspect in a minute. We can tell you that according to my sources, the suspect who was killed by the officers there while in the act of this mass shooting is, quote, unknown to federal law enforcement officials. That's what has them scrambling tonight. Now, as you saw earlier in Marianne Favreau's piece, there was a massive federal law enforcement response and presence in Gilroy, not just state and local officers. My sources tell me that in addition to very top FBI officials from around the area there, specialists from alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and explosives, ATF, are also on the scene. They have recovered at least one weapon, a long bore gun, that's a rifle or a shotgun, as well as shell casings used by that suspected gunman. The feds are already using their high technologies and their sources to trace that weapon and the ballistics on the casings of those bullets and the casings from the shells. I've also learned that FBI counterintelligence officers are working this case. And here's what we know so far. A federal law enforcement command post has been set up in addition to local police command center. FBI's SWAT team is on the scene, plus those ATF specialists. The main focus for them right now, as far as the federal sources tell me, is to help collect and preserve evidence, including the immediate tracing of that gun and any ballistics, which has already started, according to my sources. Counterintelligence agents are also already checking the background of this suspect to see if he has any ties whatsoever to either domestic or foreign hate or terrorist groups. Now, I got to caution, this is standard procedure in cases like this. There is no connection at this point. We've done some checking on our own, however, and according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks these hate groups in the U.S., there are 61 active hate groups in California with 83 different chapters, including many right here in Northern California. Now, to reiterate, there is no indication that the gunman was tied to any one of these, at least right now. This is standard federal law enforcement and counterintelligence work. But the fact that he apparently cut through a fence, was dressed in some type of gear, and may have had assistance has federal officials on high alert and looking for someone else even as we speak. Again, they tell me they have heard, quote, my source said, we've heard of this second suspect, but they have no evidence that person exists. They also have FLIR and heat-seeking devices in the air and on the ground. So if somebody's hiding in a creek bed or in the woods, they will see that body from the heat and infrared. According to one federal law enforcement source, quote, this guy, meaning the gunman, was, quote, not on our radar, and that's disturbing. We'll stay on this.
Well, Stephen, you gave us a lot of information, very pertinent information. Just to clarify 3 points here. The gunman, the suspected gunman, unknown to federal law enforcement,
that's right.
Correct?
They know who he is. They've checked him out because obviously, as the police chief said, they killed him. He engaged with officers, police officers, and federal agents are already running his fingerprints, running that gun and ballistics. They don't know who he is. He is not a known entity to them, to counterintelligence.
And then so number two, they found the longboard rifle or the gun. They found it near the area, obviously.
They found it there with him. I asked if there were other weapons, and they say there may have been, but right now they do have at least one weapon in their possession, and again, the ballistics, which they're already running. We've done stories on this Nibin where they can trace the hammer on the end of the guns and the shell casing. They're already running that nationwide, trying to see if there's any connections to any kind of domestic group.
And then witnesses describe the gunman as someone in his 30s, a white male. Did that also fact check with the FBI and your sources?
That's what my sources are saying. Again, I didn't just talk to FBI sources. I talked to several different other federal sources who've asked not to be identified. They tell me that this all checks out. Again, there's been different descriptions by different witnesses, and they caution that in situations like this, sometimes witnesses plain old get it wrong. There's panic, a gunshot.
Sure.
And so they could have gotten things wrong. That's why they're being very cautious about this second suspect.
Right.
They have no evidence of that at this point, other than people saying there may have been somebody else involved. They do believe it's only one gunman actually pulling the trigger and shooting folks, and he appears to have been dressed in some kind of fatigue or dress out gear, is how it was described to me. And what that means is he came to do some damage, apparently, and cut through that fence, as the chief described, just to do what he did.
So what they're trying to figure out at this point was this just one lone wolf guy who went out there
that's right.
to try
or was
to
he
figure
tied
out
to some group to try to make some statement? And so far, there's been no evidence of that, but they're working this right now, even as we speak.
And Stephen, you're saying that they have positively identified this individual, that federal sources know who he is.
They know who he is.
And they have identified him, and then now they're working to backtrack to figure out if he's linked to anyone else.
That's
or
exactly
if he's
right.
a lone wolf.
That's exactly right. As they say, this guy was not on our radar, which does indicate he may be a lone wolf, because they would have at least, they have sources in these hate groups. They have connections, and they would know if this person was a big mover and shaker in one of these groups, they would know him right away. And right now they're saying, we've never heard of this guy before now.
But clearly a person who knew how to get into this area and knew the landscape and knew that there was going to be security at these different checkpoints.
That's right.
And had found what was the the weak point in getting into the Garlic Festival. So this is someone who knew what they were doing. By
cutting through the fence. And
exactly.
That's what, yeah, absolutely. And that's what disturbs these federal officials. And that's why you see this overwhelming federal response. I've been told by several sources that very top federal folks from the West Coast are there on the scene even as we speak. And there are even folks that are undercover agents who are there trying to work this to see if there's any connection at all. No definitive answers yet, but that's what they're doing even as we speak.
And we'll know in the next 24, 48 hours, as often this case. And also we know that the president was briefed shortly after this, because we saw his tweet a few hours ago.